Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Sallallahu sallam wa baraka ala nabina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajmain. So before we begin, there's one housekeeping item, and that is related to the start and ending time. Now that the time has changed, wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Now that the time has changed, and Maghrib is coming in about 7:40-ish, and Salat al-Isha is closer to 8:40, 9 o'clock. I think it would be prudent if we started at 6:30 and went till Maghrib. That way we're getting you out earlier, especially on Mondays, because people might be fasting leading up to Ramadan. And if they break their fast at Maghrib, they have to wait until Salat al-Isha, another hour later, to go home and have dinner. So if we're all in agreement and okay with that, I've already spoken with the Imam. So next week, inshallah ta'ala, we'll meet at 6:30 p.m. here at the masjid. We'll go for roughly an hour, make Salat al-Maghrib, and after Maghrib, people are free to go home. Yes, Hussam?
You're going to vote to see if everyone's okay with that.
Well, we just did. I said if everyone is good with that, and everybody was kind of like nodding their head. And so sometimes you just have eyes, and the eyes have it, brother. You don't have to actually go around and do a ballot or anything like that. So with that said, tonight we'll begin a series on fasting, night prayer, and towards spiritual growth in Ramadan. And we'll begin tonight's session with the hadith collected by At-Tabarani and Al-Hakim on the authority of Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As, in which the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wasallam, he said, "Inna al-imana la yakhlaqu fi jawfi ahadikum kama yakhlaqu al-thawb. فاسألوا الله أن يجدد الإيمان في قلوبكم. آمين يا رب العالمين." So in this hadith, the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam, he said, "Verily faith wears out in the heart of one of you like a garment wears out. So ask Allah to renew the faith in your hearts." And so we see this in this hadith, brothers and sisters, that the Prophet ﷺ is indicating that faith, it wears out. And simultaneously, he's encouraging us to actively seek to renew our faith or have it renewed. And the month of Ramadan and the prescribed rituals it contains are an excellent means to renew our faith. And this means to renew our faith is something built into our religion. We can basically renew our faith and renew our commitment to Allah and our connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to His religion, annually. Through what? Through the ritual of fasting and all that comes with it in Ramadan. But we have to understand that Ramadan and everything that comes with it, like other means, it can only produce the desired result if it is approached and applied as intended, if it is taken or employed or utilized as prescribed. It's kind of like medicine. Medicine is what? It's a means toward an end. Is that not so? So, for example, you go to a doctor and you say, I have X and Y, Z symptoms. He says, he does his examination, runs some tests, and he says, yeah, you have an infection. And I'm going to prescribe for you this medication, which will help you to what? It will treat your infection and make you better. But you have to take this medicine 3 times a day, every day, for 14 days with food. So the person has this means, but the means is only as effective as what? The one who utilizes it, and only if he utilizes it appropriately so that it can have its efficacy. So if this person takes this prescription and he puts it what? On the shelf, he's not going to get better. Or he'll get better, but it'll take what? A lot longer than if he had taken the medicine. Or if he takes the medicine once a day with food, or twice a day without food. then again, it will take longer than expected. In fact, the illness may even get worse. Because if you take, for example, an antibiotic and you don't take correctly, a lot of times what the virus will do what? It will morph into something even stronger, and the antibiotic will no longer have any efficacy. Al-Muhim, I use this analogy to say that Ramadan, it can renew our faith, but only if we approach it correctly. If we approach it the wrong way, or if we only employ it half of the way it was intended, or part of the way it was intended, we'll only get what? Half or part of the benefit. And there are actually some people who go into Ramadan, they don't employ it correctly, they don't approach it correctly, and rather than getting something good out of it, they get sin. They actually get sin out of Ramadan. And we have statements of the Prophet ﷺ in which he said something to indicate this. So for example, he says in the hadith, he says, "Man lam yada' qawl az-zur wal 'amal bihi wal jahl, falaysa lillahi haja an yada' ta'amahu wa sharaba." He said, whoever in the month of fasting doesn't abandon falsehood in word and deed, and ignorant behavior, sin, then Allah has no need that he should abandon his food and drink. Meaning Allah is not going to accept it. You guys see that? And so it's very important for us to understand that if we approach Ramadan correctly, we'll get the benefit. If we don't, we won't. And that's why in this series of lectures, what we're going to strive to do is to remind ourselves of what it really means to fast. What it really means to fast Ramadan, both from the material perspective and from the spiritual perspective. And the goal is to use these talks to help us get in the right frame of mind and to go into the month with the mindset that will propel us to have a rewarding and faith-renewing experience in Ramadan. And before I begin, I want to say this, and this is very important, that at bottom, religion is a spiritual exercise. At bottom, it's a spiritual exercise. But we have to understand that there is a method to that spiritual exercise. And that's why, as part of what we have to talk about, is the nuts and bolts, the do's and don'ts. And we can't ignore that because, again, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, yes, He wants us to seek Him out spiritually, seek nearness to Him spiritually, but He's given us what? A method to achieve that. It's not up to us to say, what makes me feel good? What makes me feel fulfilled? What makes me feel close to Allah? It's no, what will draw us closer to Allah based upon what He has prescribed. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us that regardless of how we may feel about what we do and how we approach it, it won't be accepted by Him and it won't bear the fruits unless we do it His way. And one example is the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, which he said, "Man amila amal laysa alayhi amruna fahuwa rad." Whoever does a religious deed but does it in a way other than the way we prescribed, it won't be accepted. It'll be rejected. And so we don't want anyone to think, because one of the things we do want to talk about a lot is what? How to draw close to Allah in Ramadan, the spiritual aspect. But we have to understand a part of that is the ritual aspect, the means, the practical means of doing this. And so a lot of what we're going to talk about also is that as well. طيب, so what is Ramadan? Ramadan is the 9th month of the lunar Islamic calendar, and is the month which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has designated as the month of fasting, which is one of the pillars and therefore one of the most fundamental aspects or ritual practices of Islam. So when the Prophet said in the hadith of Ibn Umar, he said, when he said, "Buni al-Islam ala khams," Islam is built upon what? 5 things, and he mentioned Sawm Ramadan, right? Fast in the month of Ramadan. This is what he was referring to, fasting that month, which is what? One of the pillars of Islam, one of the most important aspects of Islam. And this Ramadan is a highly virtuous month. And among the virtues of the month of among the virtues of Ramadan is that it is the month of the Quran. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, Surah Al-Baqarah, the 2nd chapter, verse number 185, He says, "Shahr Ramadan alladhi unzila fihi al-Quran." The month of Ramadan in which the Quran was revealed. It is the month of the Quran because it is the month in which the revelation of the Quran was initiated. It's also the month of the Quran because it is in that month that Jibreel would come to the Prophet ﷺ fi kulli layla, every night, وَيُدَارِسُهُ al-Quran. He would what? Revise the Quran with the Prophet ﷺ. Come to him every night and they would review and revise the Quran together. So it is a month of the Quran. It is also the month of the Quran because the early Muslims in the month of the Quran, in the month of Ramadan I should say, they would turn their focus almost entirely to the Quran. Almost singularly to the Quran in Ramadan. To the point that Imam Ahmed, a great scholar of hadith, he used to hold these majalis of hadith where people would gather around him and he would narrate the hadith. He would do what? He would close up all of his books and say, Hada shahru Quran. This is the month of the Quran. We're not going to study hadith, we're going to focus on the Quran. Malik ibn Anas, another great scholar of Islam, again, and who had his primary focus was hadith. He would have these huge majalis and people would come and they would write the hadith that he would dictate and teach. He would do the same thing. He would suspend all of his teaching and say, Hada shahru al-Quran. Uthman ibn Affan, who had a great affinity for the Quran. Not to say that the other companions didn't, but Uthman ibn Affan had a great affinity for the Quran to the point that he used to say to all of his companions, he used to say, لو طهرت قلوبكم ما شبعت من كلمات ربكم. He used to say, if your hearts were really pure, they would never get their fill. They would never get enough of the words of Allah. And Uthman ibn Affan, just to show you how much of an affinity he had for the Quran, when his house was surrounded, and he knew that the people who had come to assassinate him at some point were going to burst through that door and complete the job which they had come to complete. Uthman ibn Affan, he didn't start to write his will or pass out his inheritance. He didn't say his goodbyes to his wives. Uthman ibn Affan put on a pair of sarawil, put on a pair of pants and tied them tight so that whatever happens, my awrah will not be exposed because he was very shy. Then he sat down and he opened up the Mus'haf and he started reading. One of the last things that he did to be what? Qira'at al-Quran. Uthman ibn Affan had a great affinity for the Quran, and in Ramadan this affinity came through, shining through, because he used to make a khatmah. He used to complete the recitation of the Quran every day in Ramadan. Every day he would do what? A khatmah. And this is not, don't think that this is exaggeration, this is mubalagha, this is embellishment. No. They actually would spend the entire day reading the Quran to the point they were able to complete the reading of the Quran in one day. Uthman ibn Affan. And there's also narrations about a Shafi'i rahimahullah ta'ala that he used to make a khatmah. He used to make khatmatain. He used to make 2 khatam. He would complete the reading of the Quran twice a day, once in the morning and once in what? In the night, 60 khatam. He would complete the Quran's reading 60 times in Ramadan. Al-Muhim, all of this shows you how the early Muslims used to focus their attention on the Quran, give a great deal of importance to the Quran. And many of us nowadays, brothers and sisters, we can't even do what? One khatmah. Ramadan comes and goes and we haven't completed what? The Quran. We busy ourselves with cooking, we busy ourselves with eating, we busy ourselves with shopping, we busy ourselves with watching TV and staying up late at night. And all this time that we could be spending getting closer to Allah by reading the book of Allah, we spend it doing what? Doing other things which will not benefit us in this world or in the hereafter. Another one of the fada'il, one of the virtues of Ramadan is that the doors of paradise are flung open on their hinges and the gates of hell are locked shut. وقد ثبت عند مسلم بن أبي هريرة, it has been authentically reported by Muslim authority Abu Hurairah that the Prophet ﷺ said, إذا جاء رمضان فتحت أبواب الجنة وغلقت أبواب النار وسفدت الشياطين. He said, ﷺ, he said that when Ramadan comes, the gates of paradise are flung open, the gates of hell are locked shut, and those most mischievous of the shayateen are what? They're locked down, they're chained, they're shackled and bound. Number 3 from the virtues of Ramadan is that it contains Laylat al-Qadr. It contains what they call the night of power, the night of decree. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned in the Quran that this night is better than 1,000 months. Better than 1,000 months in what way? That the worship that a person does on the night of Qadr, the night of decree, is greater in the scales and more worthy of reward in the sight of Allah than if he did the same worship 1,000 nights outside of Laylat al-Qadr. Right? As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Laylat al-Qadr khayrun min alfi shahr. Laylat al-Qadr is better than 1,000 months. Number 4 from the virtues of Ramadan is that the one who fasts the month of Ramadan sincerely, all of his previous sins will be forgiven. Ramadan is the month of forgiveness. The month that gives us the perfect opportunity to obtain Allah's forgiveness. As the Prophet said in the hadith of Bukhari Muslim, he said, "Man sama Ramadan iman wa ihtisaban, ghufir lahu ma taqaddama min dhanbi." He said that whoever fasts the month of Ramadan seeking Allah's pleasure and out of faith in Him, all of his previous sins will be forgiven. And last but not least, from the Fada'il, as-Saafiy Husam, the last but not least from the Fada'il of Ramadan is that the hasanat, the reward that we get for the deeds that we do in Ramadan are tudaf, they are multiplied. And we get far more reward for the deeds we do in Ramadan than the reward we would get if we did the same deeds outside of Ramadan. ويدل ذلك, and this is evidenced by some of the statements of the early Muslims. For example, Ibrahim al-Nakha'i, he said, تسبيحة في رمضان تعدل ألف تسبيحة فيما سواه. He said that one saying of Subhanallah in the month of Ramadan is equal to 1,000 sayings of Subhanallah outside of Ramadan. And so it's important for us, critical for us to strive in Ramadan to do as much good as we can. And we should not belittle or downplay the significance of any good that we might do, right? Any good that you might do. You might, so for example, somebody might be outside asking for donations for something. And you're like, oh man, I don't have any cash on me. Well, I have like some pocket change. You say, oh, what's that going to do? No, that pocket change in Ramadan could be like what? Thousands of dollars outside of Ramadan. Like Ibrahim al-Nakha'i said, tasbihatun, one tasbihah in Ramadan is like alf tasbihah, 1,000 of those outside of Ramadan. You guys see that? So we don't belittle any good deed. Smiling at your brother, giving salams to your brother, checking on your brother, whatever it is, we don't belittle any good deed because the reward we'll get for it in Ramadan is much greater than outside of Ramadan. طيب ثم بعد ذلك, what is the ruling of fasting in Ramadan? طيب, fasting in the month of Ramadan, واجب على كل مسلم عاقل بالغ خال من موانع. Fasting in Ramadan is obligatory upon every mentally able, mature, able-bodied Muslim, free of inhibitors. Muslimin, عاقل بالغ قادر خال من الموانع. Mentally able. What does that mean? It means they're able to form an intention and maintain it. So for example, you have some people who struggle with early onset dementia, for example. Or you have people who they have mental delayedness. You have people who have other mental incapacities which make them either unable to form an intention, or they have the ability to form an intention which is intermittent, meaning at some parts of the day or some parts of the week or some days of the week they're able to what? They're in their right mind, they're able to form an intention, and other times they're not. And so those people are not required to fast, not expected to fast, not obligated to fast. Number two, mature. We said baligh. Mature would mean pubescent, as opposed to immature and under the age of religious responsibility, what we call a taklif. These two, mentally able and pubescent or mature, are evidenced by the hadith قال البخاري من ثوت علي رضي الله عنه, which he said, أما علمت أن القلم رفع عن ثلاث عن الصبي حتى يدرك والنائم حتى يستيقظ والمجنون حتى يفيق. He said, are you not aware that the pen has been lifted from 3? The pen of what? Iqab. The pen of punishment. The pen of being responsible. The pen of being held accountable is lifted from 3. The first one is a young person until what? Until he comes of age. Right? So it's not obligatory for a person who is not pubescent to fast. It's lifted from the person who is sleeping until he what? He awakens. And it's lifted from the person who is mentally incapable. Until what? Until he returns to mental capacity. You guys see that? Number 3 is able-bodied. As opposed to being temporarily ill or permanently ill or a person of extremely advanced age or someone who's pregnant, a woman who's pregnant or breastfeeding. All of them are considered غير قادرين. They're unable. They're not able-bodied and not able to do it. And so they're pardoned. ويدل ذلك, this is evidenced by the ayah in the Quran where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَالَّذِينَ يُطِيقُونَهُ فِدْيَةٌ طَعَامُ مِسْكِينٍ. And as for those who can fast but do so with great difficulty, then rather than fast, let them feed for every day a poor person. Number 4, Muslim. Fasting is not obligatory upon non-Muslims, and if they fast, it won't be accepted from them. If they fast, it won't be accepted from them. ويدل ذلك, and this is evidenced by the ayah in the Quran from Surah At-Tawbah, the 54th verse of Surah number 9, in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَا مَنَعَهُمْ أَن تُقْبَلَ مِنْهُمْ نَفَقَاتُهُمْ إِلَّا أَنَّهُمْ كَفَرُوا بِاللَّهِ وَبِرَسُولِهِ. He said, and nothing prevented their charitable offerings, their good deeds, these non-Muslims, from being accepted, except that they disbelieved in Allah and His Messenger. The fact that they disbelieved prevented their good deeds from being accepted. Number 5, we said, خَالٍ مِنْ مَوَانِعٍ, free of inhibitors. The inhibitors from fasting, على رأسها, at the top of them, are menstruation and postpartum bleeding. That it's not permissible for a woman in either one of these two states to fast. ويدل ذلك, this is evidenced by the hadith by Bukhari Muslim on Abi Sa'id al-Khudri, in which the Prophet said, أَلَيْسَتِ الْمَرْأَةِ إِذَا حَاضَتْ لَمْ تُصَلِّ وَلَمْ تَصُمْ. He said, is it not so? Certainly it is the case that when a woman is menstruating, she does not fast and she doesn't pray. And it happened also in the time of the companions, radwanullahi ta'ala alayhim, that a woman came to Aisha and she said, ما بال الحائض. She said, explain to me the situation of the woman who's menstruating. تصلي ولا تقضي. لا تصلي وتقضي ولا تصوم وتقضي. She said, explain to me the situation of the woman who's menstruating. She doesn't pray, and she doesn't make up those days that she doesn't pray. She doesn't fast, but she has to make up the days she didn't fast. So Aisha, she said, كان يصيبنا ذلك في عهد النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم فأمرنا أن ندع الصلاة ولا نقضي وأن ندع الصوم ونقضي. She said that this used to happen to us. We used to menstruate during the time of the Prophet ﷺ. We were told to leave prayer and not to make up the missed prayers, and to leave fasting and to make up for the missed fast. You guys see that? And so what Aisha is telling her is like, this is how the religion is. Whether you understand it or not, this is how it is. Allah has His wisdom for allowing us not to have to make up the prayers, but to have to make up the fast. Al-Muhim, these two ahadith are evidence that women who are menstruating and they're in postpartum bleeding, that is an inhibitor. That is something which prevents them from fasting. There's a few notes on this point. Number 1, we said that in order for fasting to be obligatory, that the person had to be baligh. The person had to be of age. Is that not so? That's what we said. But does that mean if a person is not of age that they can't fast?
No.
Is that what we're saying? So can they fast? So for example, if we have a child of 10 years old or 9 years old, can they fast? Absolutely. Not only can they fast, they are encouraged to fast. They should be encouraged to fast if they are able to, if they're capable of doing it. And this is important because sometimes a child becomes baligh, they become of age, what we would consider early, 12 years old, 13 years old. And parents would be like, oh, still a baby, still young. So, khaliha, khalihi. Leave them, don't make them fast because they're still young. No, once they come of age, they what? They have to fast. But if they haven't come of age and they're able to fast, we should what? Encourage them even though they don't have to. ويدل ذلك, and this is evidenced by the hadith of Bukhari on the authority of Rubayya bint Mu'awwadh. On the authority of Rubayya bint Mu'awwadh, in which she said, كنا نسومه أي عاشوراء ونصوم سبياننا. She said, we used to fast Ashura, and we would also make our little ones fast. And she went on to say that some of them, they were able to fast, but it was new for them. It was different for them. So some of them would cry, they would complain, they would ask for food. And she said, rather than تغلبهم الشفقة, rather than be overcome with sympathy and empathy and compassion for their kids, because the initial response of the parent when their child complains and they don't want to fast is what? Is to think, I'm being sympathetic if I let them eat because they don't have to. But the real sympathy is the spiritual sympathy. That's the sympathy that should take precedence. I care about your soul. It's important for you to what? Tata'awwad. It's important for you to get used to this. Right? At this young age. I want to teach you the importance of fasting from this young age. I want it to become part of what? Part of who you are. Part of your DNA. So when it comes time that you have to fast, it just comes natural for you. And so what she said they used to do is, rather than give them food, they would give them something to play with, right? To distract them until what? Until it was time to break fast. And so we have to understand as parents is that we're not being mean to our kids. And some people may actually make us feel bad that we're being mean to them because we're making them fast. They don't have to fast. We're not being mean to them. We're actually being very kind to them, but from what? From a different perspective. And you see that the best guidance is the guidance of Muhammad, and the best guidance is the guidance of his companions, and this is what they used to do. We can't go wrong by following their example. طيب ثم بعد ذلك, we also have as a proof that the early Muslims used to have their young ones fast. There's a mu'allaq hadith or mu'allaq athar from Umar collected by Bukhari, in which it mentions that he came across a sakran. He came across a person who was publicly intoxicated in the month of Ramadan. And Umar, being Umar, he struck him. And then he said, Wayhak. Wayhak wa sibyan siyam. He said, what's wrong with you? You're not fasting, and our little ones are fasting. You guys see that? And so this shows you that the early Muslims used to have their young ones fast, and so we're encouraged to make them fast. When we do this, another note, when we make them fast, not only will they get reward for fasting, they will get rewarded for that, but we'll get reward too. وَيَدُلِّ ذَلِكَ, this is evidenced by the hadith of a Muslim, in which the Prophet ﷺ, he came across a rakab, he came across a caravan of people, and he asked them, he said, who are you? And they said, we are Muslims, jokingly, right? And then they asked the Prophet, and who are you? He said, Ana Rasulullah. He said, I'm the Messenger of Allah. So then when he said that, a woman who had a child with her, maybe Hussam, how are you now? Maybe Hussam's age or a little younger than Hussam, right? She lifted him up to the Prophet ﷺ, and she said, Ali hadha hajj. Can this one make hajj? And the Prophet said, Naam walaki ajr. He said, yes, he can make hajj and be rewarded, and you'll get a reward. You'll get a reward too. طيب ثم بعد ذلك, who is permitted not to fast? And we're going to close with this one. I think the adhan is about, what is it, 10 minutes from now, or what time is the adhan?
I think 10 minutes from now.
Okay, so we'll close with this one and maybe allow for any questions or comments. طيب, who is permitted not to fast? So the first one is, or the first group of those who are permitted not to fast are al-marid wal-musafir. The person who is traveling and the person who is ill. Now, the person who is excused from fasting who is ill is the one who has a serious injury. It's not somebody who, for example, they get a paper cut. Oh, I'm sick. And they want to break their fast, right? They're not someone who their throat is a little scratchy. But it's somebody who has a serious injury who, if they fast, they'll be harmed by fasting. Or their healing from this serious injury or illness will be delayed because they fasted. That's the person who's able to break his fast. So a person has like a mild cold, a person has a sore throat, a person has a little soreness in his elbow. That person cannot what? Cannot break his fast. But a person who has a serious illness and the healing from that or recovering from that, I should say, will be delayed by fasting is permitted to what? To break their fast. But also the person who's traveling and allowed to break their fast is one who travels about 48 miles or more with the intention of traveling. Not a person who just gets in their car and they want to blow off steam. They just drive. Next thing they're like, oh, I've driven 50 miles. I can eat something, right? No, they have to leave their home with the intention of what? Of traveling somewhere. They have to leave their home with the intention of traveling. And this is what ma'afta bihi, this is what the fatawa of Ibn Abbas and Ibn Umar indicate. That's what they basically said. Although the traveling person is permitted to terminate their fast. One of us, for example, was going to go on the weekend for business in Ohio someplace, right? That's more than 48 miles, right? And you're going to be over there for the weekend. That person is permitted to break their fast during Ramadan. Although they're permitted to do so, it's preferred, they are encouraged to fast. It's better if they actually fast, if they can do so, if they don't find like difficulty or hardship in fasting. And this is evidenced by the famous hadith where the Prophet ﷺ, he traveled with his companions during Ramadan. And he started out that day of Ramadan traveling and fasting. And he traveled for a period of time, and then he came to know, he was told that الناس قد شق عليهم الصوم. He said, some of your companions, fasting has become difficult for them. And they don't want to break their fast because you're fasting. They don't want to, they know that they could, but they want to follow your sunnah. If you're fasting, they want to fast too, but it's become difficult for them. So the Prophet ﷺ, he went to the top or the front of the caravan where everybody could see him. And he did what? And he drank, he broke his fast. And then he told the people to break their fast. Al-Muhim, the scholars of Islam, when they looked at this hadith, they said, if it were better, if it were more virtuous to not fast, the Prophet wouldn't have fasted. The fact that he did fast shows it's better to what? To fast while traveling. But you can what? You can break it, right? Inda al-mashaqqa, if there's some difficulty. The second group of people who are permitted to not fast are menstruating women or women experiencing postpartum bleeding. In fact, not only they're permitted, they're expected. They're obligated not to fast. If they fasted, it wouldn't be accepted, and they would actually be what? Sinful, because they would be violating the order of the Prophet ﷺ. Type number 3, and we already mentioned the dalil, the evidence for that. Number 3, the pregnant and breastfeeding woman who fears for herself or her child. And this is the fatwa of Ibn Abbas and Ibn Umar again. So a pregnant and breastfeeding woman who fears for her child, both of them are permitted to what? To not fast. And they're given the choice between two options. One option is to not fast, to terminate the fast, and to make up the missed days at a later time. The other option is to terminate the fast and to feed for every day missed one poor person. So they're given the option. It's up to them to decide how they want to make up for the days that they missed. Either actually fasting those days from other days or feeding a poor person for every day. And this is the fatwa, as I said, of Ibn Umar and Ibn Abbas. Number 4, and the last one that we'll mention tonight, of the people who are permitted not to fast, is the one who is unable to fast because of old age or because of a chronic illness. Chronic illness is different from the illness we talked about earlier. Person gets a respiratory infection. It's going to pass, inshallah. That person is from the first group. Doesn't fast and makes up the days he missed from other days. Person with a chronic illness, diabetes, chronic hypertension, right? some type of heart disease, some type of other ailment where it would be unsafe, unhealthy. It could actually put his life at risk if he fasted. Or a person who's extremely old and fasting is harmful to his health, puts his health at risk because of his age. Those people are permitted to not fast and to feed for every day that they don't fast a poor person. And Ibn Abi Shaybah, he mentioned that Anas, when he became older, and Anas lived to be about 103 years old. He lived to be pretty old. And so when he got old, he wouldn't fast. He would terminate the fast. He would not fast. And then at the end of Ramadan, he would gather 30 poor people and feed them a meal, right? So feeding one poor person for every day of Ramadan. And Ibn Abbas, he mentions, as recorded in Daraqutni, that a Shaykh al-Kabir, that the elderly person does not fast, but rather feeds for every day, missed of fasting, a poor person. And with that, brothers and sisters, we have mentioned what we wanted to share tonight regarding the ahkam of fasting, and there'll be more inshallah ta'ala next week. Again, remember that next week we'll be starting at 6:30, and we do have a few moments that we could spare for any questions or comments that you might have. هذا وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد. تفضل حسام.
My first question is...
Your first question. That sounds ominous. Go ahead.
Do the people in the grave, do all their sins get forgiven?
The people in the grave? By virtue of what? Would the people in the grave, will all their sins be forgiven by virtue of what? What are you connecting that to? What would lead their sins to be forgiven?
If they usually, like, in Ramadan time, if they usually complete all the Quran and they have intentions to do that every single month, and they did until, like, they died. After that, the next Ramadan, do they still get the blessings?
You're saying that once they pass away, if it was their habit, do they continue to get credit because that was their habit even after they passed away? So no, unfortunately, Hussam, once a person is deceased, they won't continue to get reward in their grave except for three things. And those types of deeds that you mentioned are not from those three things. So the three things are waladun salih, a righteous offspring, yad'ula, that prays for them, ilmun yuntafa'a bih, knowledge from which people benefit. So if that person left behind a book that they wrote, or they bought a huge library and donated it for people would come and read those books for free, etc. Or sadaqatun jariyah, or they do a perpetual charity. So they give something that continues to what? It continues to give. For example, they dig a well.
Like if they teach someone how to pray and they keep doing the good deeds for it.
What's that?
If they teach someone how to pray and they keep doing the good deeds for it.
Yes, that person prays, they will share in that person's reward. That's an example of ilmun yuntafa'a bih, knowledge from which people benefit. Yes. But the deeds that they did throughout their life, even if it was a habit, once they pass away, the reward for those deeds will end with their passing. Make sense? تفضل سعد.
When you say that their sins are going to be forgiven, is it their major sins or their...
Jazakallah khairan. All those ahadith, and this is bil ijma', this is by agreement of the scholars of Ahl Sunnah. All of those ahadith where the Prophet says, if a person does this, غُفِرْ لَهُ مَا تَقَدَّمَ مِنْ ذَنْبِهِ, right? His previous sins will be forgiven. His future sins will be forgiven. The sins of the coming year will be forgiven. The sins of the previous year will be forgiven. All those ahadith, they refer to the minor sins, not the major sins. The major sins require a tawbah. And one of the proofs that the scholars give to support this is the hadith where the Prophet said, he said, as-salawat al-khams, wal-jum'atu ila al-jum'ah, ورمضان إلى رمضان مكفرات لما بينهن إذا اجتنبت الكبائر. He said that the 5 daily prayers, one to another, and one Jum'ah to the next, and one Ramadan to the following one, will expiate the sins that are committed between them. إذا اجتنبت الكبائر, if a person avoids the major sins. Prophet's teaching us two things. One, that the sins that get expiated are not what? The kaba'ir. Because he's saying you have to avoid the kaba'ir. So what sins are left to be expiated? The minor sins. You see that? He's also teaching there's something called what? Major sins, kaba'ir. There's something called major sins, and that those major sins require something else to be expiated. And so those are hadith. And think about it too. If the salawat al-khams, Ramadan itself, and al-Jum'ah, they can't expiate the, and these are obligations. These are obligations. They can't expiate the major sins. How can a nafil, how can a non-obligatory thing, like for example, Sawm Ashura, how can that expiate the major sins? You see that? Like, any other questions? Yes, they actually have to fast that day. And go ahead.
But if they're pregnant, they have the option of feeding.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Absolutely. Absolutely. They have that option. And this is the fatwa Ibn Abbas and Ibn Umar. And we don't have any mukhalif. We don't have any companion who raised a contending voice. So that indicates that what? They're all in agreement that these are two acceptable options for the postpartum. Postpartum. And breastfeeding and pregnant woman. Breastfeeding and pregnant woman. Sorry.
I was going to ask in the next class if you could clarify that. If you said it was all because I listened to the information that it said it wasn't like, from what I understood, it wasn't exactly like an option.
Mm-hmm.
It was more of like a scale of like, if this applies, or this applies.
Mm-hmm.
For a woman who is pregnant or nursing, that if she fears for her own health and she breaks her fast, then she makes up her days.
Mm-hmm.
If she fears for this health or safety of her child,
Mm-hmm.
then she has to pay for, like, she has to feed, not pay, she has to feed. And in some cases, in some evidence, it says she has to feed and fast if she fears for her child. So that's what I understood from, like, if it's for yourself, like, I'm sick, I'm so tired, I'm sick, and I don't feel well, I can make my days. Or if I think that my child is not going to get enough nutrition, then I pay. That's information that I knew. So I didn't know if, like what Hamza said, like, if there was any more clarification on that.
There are some contemporaries who make the distinction that you mentioned. But that's not what the early Muslims, and particularly Ibn Abbas and Ibn Umar, that's not what they said. So, for example, they were very blanket in what they said. They said, as for al-hamil wal-murda'. They said, as for al-hamil, the pregnant woman, wal-murda', the breastfeeding woman. And then they gave their fatwa that they don't fast. They don't fast and they feed for every day. Miskeen. They didn't say, well, if what? If they fear for their child, they do this. If they fear for themselves, they do that. And so the scholars who follow their very blanket and general guidance will say that the pregnant woman and the breastfeeding woman, whether she fears for herself or her child, either or, then this is what she does. And she's mukhayyar, she's given the choice. So there's no haram in her making up the days later, choosing to make up the days later rather than feed a poor person. Although the fatwa comes and says she doesn't fast and she feeds a poor person. But the scholars are agreed that she does have that option because there's no sin on her if she were to make up the days later, to choose to actually fast. And so when we get in a situation like this, I know as laymen it can be confusing for us. But it won't be confusing if we have certain general principles. That when the knowledge comes to us and we have the statement of Ashab Rasulullah, the statement of the companions of the Messenger of Allah. And we have the statement of a scholar of high repute. And the people that you're mentioning this from are of high repute. No disrespect to these scholars, but they will never have the knowledge, the understanding, and the right to deference that the companions will have. And so we respectfully disagree with them. So what I'll try to do is remember to bring the actual Athar of Ibn Abbas and quote it so you can hear the wording of it and see that clearly it's a blanket. But I'll just say that, yeah, I know that that's out there, and I know that it can be confusing. But when we have to choose at the end of the day, one of the ways that we're going to choose is if this is the statement of the companions and we don't have a mukhalif, we don't have any companion of their same status who said, no, I disagree, then we have to go with what they said.
Another thing I wanted to ask you about that was, before Ramadan comes, like for this sister who's pregnant or nursing, does she have to have her intention prior to what her decision is going to be?
No, they didn't indicate that. They didn't indicate that. So she could go into Ramadan and she might say, I'm going to make up the days. I'm going to make up the days. That she might just, I'm going to make it up. I want to fast. I want to feel what the Muslims felt, even if it's outside of the month. And then she might get into it and say, I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I'm going to be in a position before next Ramadan to fast. And I don't want to stack Ramadans. So you know what? I'm going to feed instead. Yeah, she has that option. She's mukhayyar. It's totally her choice. And to this point, I was going to touch on this next week, and I will, but just because of what Hamza asked. Let's say that a woman chose to make up the days. Then she's truly mukhayyar. She's truly at liberty to choose the days that she wants to fast. She could say, you know what, I'm going to wait till November, December, when the days are nice and short. She could do that. She could say, I'm going to fast one day on, one day off until I complete 30 days. All totally mukhayyar. The same thing is true for the musafir, the one who traveled, and the one who was ill in Ramadan. But, and inshallah we'll nu'akkid alayh, we'll emphasize, or we'll restate it or reiterate next week. Once they start fasting, that obligatory fast, even though it's outside of Ramadan, they have to what? They have to complete it. It's different from, for example, if after Ramadan, the month of Shawwal, I'm going to fast 6 days of Shawwal. I say I'm going to fast this day, one of my days of Shawwal. I start the day and somebody invites me for lunch. And I'm like, we're going to such and such place and you're going to pick up the tab? Oh yeah, I'm coming. I'm Amiru Nafsi. I'm the leader of myself. I can break my fast because it's what? An optional fast. But if you begin an obligatory fast, you have to see it what? See it through even outside of Ramadan. You guys got that? ونؤكد إن شاء الله تعالى سنؤكد عليه. We'll reiterate this next week. هذا وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.